This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland 2010, our 10th anniversary year. Whitley Strieber's Dreamland takes you where others dare not go, to the limits of imagination and reality and beyond. Expert hosts like Jim Mars, Marla Freese, Ann Strieber, and Linda Moulton Howe are what make us special. And of course, Whitley Strieber, the world's leading authority on the unknown. Dreamland. Welcome to the edge of the world.
Today we're talking to a maverick, John Rappaport. He has, you may be familiar with him from the website nomorefakenews.com. His new website is insolutions.info. That's insolutions.info. John has worked as a freelance investigative reporter for over 20 years. He's written articles on politics, health, media, culture, you name it, and he has been there. He has his work has been submitted for a Pulitzer Prize in the past. He has hosted, produced radio programs in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. He's appeared on over 200 radio and television programs, not including this one up until now, however. He has run for Congress and done very well. He started a boycott against chemical giants. He has lectured all over the U.S. on the question, who runs the world and what can we do about it? His independent research has covered such areas as deep politics, conspiracies, alternative health, the potential of the human imagination, mind control, the medical cartel, and many, many other things, and the takeover of the planet by hidden elites. And John, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here, Whitley. Thanks.
Well, it's exciting to have you here because, of course, one of the many reasons that John is here is that he is very familiar with the issue of childhood abuse by intelligence services, something that is of a great interest to me. And John, I've been trying to figure out quite how to get into this subject together. And I think that later in this show, we're going to kind of edge into it. And here's maybe the place to start. There is something wrong. You know it and I know it, and everybody listening to this show knows it. In a country that is so devoted to the welfare of so few at the expense of so many. And maybe you could start to give us a handle on what you think has gone wrong here. Because I know it's a big, broad question, but we'll focus down as we go along.
Okay, sure. Well, one of the things that's gone wrong is what I would call the accelerated growth of organizations and institutions such as megacorporations and governments themselves, which would include both state governments and the federal government. I believe there comes a point when any organization, when it grows beyond a certain size, becomes dedicated to something other than the welfare of individuals or even groups, and it becomes a kind of a machine. And the machine is geared to accomplishing certain material objectives, making profit, increasing power and influence, getting funding if it's a government agency, for example. And then lost in the shuffle is the original reason that these organizations began in the first place. So I think that's a good starting point because what you're looking at, and everybody knows it, is inhuman institutions.
Yes, and corporations as well as the government.
Exactly.
Yeah, you encounter them every day of your lives, and we all do. I mean, talk about inhuman institutions. Health insurance companies that go and find little trivial reasons to cut off people's health insurance when they're desperate for care. It's unbelievably evil. Or big government that comes down on little individuals like some kind of a runaway freight train with utter indifference to their needs and their welfare, and following cruel, meaningless, bureaucratic rules and grinding us up as if we were in some kind of a meat grinder. I guess I'm not really much of a big institution guy, and I think we're probably together in this, in the sense that we need to do something to get these things a little bit more down to human size again.
Absolutely, I agree completely, and I think that is exactly what's been happening. And part of the reason that it's happened is because these huge organizations have experienced unprecedented success. So they discover strategies for increasing their power. They sit on a kind of platform and they look out and they say, well, look where we have come from. Look where we are now. And this has been a success based on the idea that we can look at people as units. We can look at them as conditioned reflex mechanisms. We can look at them as points of attack. And this has been our success, plus the fact that we've learned how to do internal organization sufficiently well so that we can chop up and specialize all kinds of tasks for the people who work for us to do. They become cogs in the machine as well. And so we have to continue this because this is what's led us to where we are today. And so they become even more inhuman. And therefore, the people who rise up through the ranks to gain control are naturally going to be people who are cold, analytical, who have no human feeling, because these organizations now stand for that, really, regardless of what their PR says.
And they're sociopaths, essentially, at the top of most of these organizations, including in politics. And, we've got two parties here. We've got a party of big government and a party of big corporations, but there's something missing there. What about the party of little people? We're nowhere.
Absolutely nowhere.
Absolutely nowhere. Well, John, so that is kind of the basis of where you are. But there's a lot more here, and you know a lot about what happened and what is happening to children as a result of activities in the intelligence community. And I know from my own life some things, and I'm going to kind of outline that for our subscribers on my own later today, and put that up for our subscribers and sort of tell everybody what happened to me. And I know they've been curious about that for a long time. But let's talk a little bit about the intelligence community and children. It's a terrifying subject.
It is. Actually, when I gave a talk about this, it's now 13 years ago, and I was on my way to give the lecture with a friend of mine, and I said to her, I'm never nervous when I give talks, but I feel like I'm ready to fall apart because of the just unalloyed evil that I was about to detail. And that feeling is there because basically you're dealing with innocent children.
Yes.
Who are up against a gigantic apparatus that considers them to be potential victims, potential agents, potential experimental subjects, and therefore that whatever treatment is going to be meted out to these kids is going to be horrendous, and that's the case. But again, it stems from the fact that these people are, and sociopath is a very good word, are able to look at any human being, including children, as unimportant, as humans who can be punished, written off, disposed of, as disposable entities or units in mass experimentation and forwarding the goals of intelligence agencies.
Exactly. And this has been going on in this country for a long time.
Absolutely. I became aware of it, and I was searching my memory before we went on. I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but somewhere in, I think it was early 1996, I was introduced to a therapist named Valerie Wolf, who was practicing in New Orleans. And she told me an incredible story about having testified before, it was then Clinton, before the President's Committee or Commission on Radiation.
Yes.
In Washington, D.C. on March 15, 1995. And these hearings were laid on because the Clinton administration was ready to assume responsibility for opening up the books on experiments that had been done on American citizens with radiation during the Cold War. And these experiments have been done in hospitals, for example, where you would have terminally ill patients that were given incredible doses of radiation, which is really torture.
Yes.
And the results were tabulated and so on. But in Valerie's case, she had applied to testify before the committee about two of her patients, Christy Nicola and Claudia Mullen, who in therapy had revealed to her that they had been mind control subjects as children.
Right.
And that part of their torture, you would have to say, involved certain doctors and radiation experiments. And somehow, still don't know how, she was granted permission to testify before the committee and to submit documents and so on. And she began to tell me this story, and it just came completely out of left field for me. Then I had no idea this had ever happened, that there was such a commission, that she had testified, and so she began to tell me some pretty amazing things.
Back in 2002 or 2003, we had the author of a book, The Plutonium Experiments, that won the Pulitzer Prize and eventually led to Clinton apologizing on behalf of the United States to the victims of those plutonium experiments, where people had been tricked into using motel rooms that were actually laced with plutonium in order to see, I guess, how they died or what happened to them. It's just unbelievable evil. And now, but what happened to her before the committee?
Well, Valerie went before the committee and stated that these two patients of hers, who, by the way, had given her permission to reveal what had happened in therapy, and in fact, they also testified. So she introduced these patients, and they had uncovered memories of being part of extensive CIA brainwashing programs as young children.
John, we're going to take a little break right now, and when we get back, we're going to get deeper into this very, very dark and dangerous corner, a corner I know something more about, and I'm going to be telling the subscribers exactly what I do know. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. This is The Edge of the World.
And subscribers, don't miss Critical Mass. My new book is out in paperback in stores everywhere. We're back. We're talking to John Rappaport, John's fabulous website, brand new, just up, insolutions.info. A really, really interesting website, because we need to understand this world that we have been trapped in, and we are trapped in it because we're trapped between two battling giants, big government and big business, and between the two of them, they're going to keep socking each other until this country is plunged back into the third world or farther down, unless we can regain control at the top and stop ending up electing people who talk the talk but don't walk the walk. Okay, insolutions.info. John Rappaport, before we left the air, we were beginning to talk about children and mind control. Can we continue now with this conversation? The two witnesses, what exactly did they describe having happened to them?
Well, in one case, the mind control experiments or the brainwashing started at age 7. And they testified that this included torture, rape, electroshock, powerful drugs, hypnosis, death threats, etc., etc. And that this was carried on by some combination of CIA and military people. And that then amnesia was induced to prevent their recalling these terrifying sessions,
now,
but then later the material began to surface in therapy, and it became part of their therapy, in fact, the major part of their therapy. And then Valerie Wolf, who was the therapist, decided, along with these two patients, Christy Nicola and Claudia Mullen, that they would testify on March 15th, 1995 in Washington before President Clinton's Committee on Radiation Experiments, and they somehow slipped in the door. And they spelled some of this out. Wolf, the therapist, stated that these memories in therapy were recovered without attempts at regression or hypnosis. In other words, it was spontaneous, and the therapist had not guided them or tried to get them into this in any way. So apparently, from descriptions that I've heard of what went on in the room, once they were done, there was just a kind of silence in the room. And the members of the panel then tried to sort of, I don't know whether gloss over it. They just tried to skip over it. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting, and so forth. And now we're going to move along. And because these panel members had no idea, apparently, that this stuff was going to come out. And the permission had been granted for Valerie and her patients because several doctors that the patients identified as running these horrendous brainwashing experiments on them as children had also been identified by other Americans as running radiation experiments, and so there was apparently a crossover. And then Valerie told me that once the testimony was done, as they were leaving the room, there were other people in the room who had testified about radiation experiments. And they came up to Valerie, Chris, and Claudia and said, "Thank God you said what you did, because now we're beginning to realize that we were not simply being assaulted by radiation in these experiments, but that there was a mind control element as well, that the radiation was just a part of the torture." And so there was a sort of a hullabaloo in the room, and then they left, and then the whole thing was buried, and the material is apparently that Valerie submitted to the committee on file at the National Archive, but of course nobody has talked about it since, really, in the mainstream media or in the government.
Well, if you Google Dr. Valerie Wolf, Valerie Wolf, Wolfe, and you go down to the 1995 testimony, there'll be you will find this testimony.
Yes,
it's right on the internet.
Yes, it is.
And I have to admit, I did not know about it before, so I can't describe it in great detail, folks. But you should certainly look at it. And when I'm in the subscriber section, I'm going to be sort of talking about my own experiences and also some other things that have surfaced in the news. There's no question about the fact that this is done to people. There was the famous case of Candy Jones, Long John Nebel's wife, who was quite sure that this had happened to her. And at one point on Dreamland, we interviewed the author of the book about them. And it was a very convincing story. Tell us, what do you think is done to these children?
Well, according to them, I'm just looking here in my notes, the idea was to make them into agents
That's what Candy Jones said, yeah.
Who could obtain information from people and remember it exactly and report back to their controllers. That also there was a sexual component. In other words, they were being turned into pleasure for important people.
Right, and then those people probably were then blackmailed, yeah.
That there was a lot of filming that went on.
Right, and incidentally, folks, subscribers, the June the 5th, 2004 Dreamland is available. And that is the heading is this: we explore the murky depths of CIA mind control with Donald Bain, the author of The CIA's Control of Candy Jones, the documented story of a supermodel's struggle with childhood programming. So this is what I'm saying is this is documented stuff. It just hasn't come out like the plutonium things have. Apparently, my guess it's just too horrible. They're not willing to deal with it. Is that kind of the case, or?
Yes, I mean, as a reporter, I've seen this happen, hundreds of times, where I'll come across a story not necessarily connected with what we're talking about here, but, for example, medical issues in general, that is so mind-boggling, and the first reaction is, well, this would have to be a major story in the press, but, of course, that it never was and never will be. It's just buried, or it's mentioned in a small item that disappears and no one picks up on it again. Happens time and time and time again. So it doesn't surprise me really anymore. But, for example, I'm just looking here at my notes, and this was, I believe this was Christina Cola who was testifying about a Dr. Green, a name that surfaces quite often.
Oh, my God. In a moment, folks, I'll tell you why I just said, oh, my God. Go ahead.
He often tied me down in a cage, which was near his office between 1972 and 76. He and his assistants were sometimes careless and left the cage unlocked. Whenever physically possible, I snuck into his office and found files with reports and memos addressed to the CIA and military personnel. Included in these files were project, subproject, subject, and experiment names with some of the code numbers for radiation mind control experiments, which I have submitted in my written documentation. I was caught twice, and Dr. Green tortured me ruthlessly with electric shock drugs, spinning on a table, putting shots in my stomach and my back, dislocating my joints, and hypnotic techniques to make me feel crazy and suicidal. So this was the kind of treatment that she received, and she talks about being trained to be an agent, to be a spy, essentially, and also to be used for blackmail purposes vis-a-vis sex. The name Dr. John Gittinger is mentioned by Claudia Mullen, who was an important assistant in the CIA mind control program called MKUltra. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb is mentioned, who was the head of the MKUltra program, as involved in these experiments on children. So Claudia Mullen states she was adopted when she was 2 years old. By the time she reached 7, she had already been abused extensively by her mother, who apparently turned her over for, quote, testing the CIA-connected people, and Claudia then entered a 27-year period of what can only be called enslavement. States that she's been monitored and still being monitored, etc., lives in New Orleans, has given information to local police authorities about her situation, and again, similar to Chris, agent, trained as an agent, trained to spy, trained in using sex for blackmail with, quote, important people. So this apparently was significant. And I have to say here that one of the interesting things that happened when I was writing this story...
We're going to have to take another little break. It seems like the wind. And when we get back, we're going to go back into the story he's about to tell and also into some quite startling information about Dr. Green. We'll be right back.
This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. We go deeper.
We're talking to John Rappaport about childhood abuse of children by intelligence operatives, or people who appear to be intelligence operatives. John's website, insolutions.info, insolutions.info. Don't miss it. It's one of the places you can go to learn a few things about the way this world of ours really works as the giant corporations and giant government battle it out, and we end up the losers. So do go to insolutions.info and find out what's really going on in this really crazy, dangerous world of ours. John, you were just about to begin a story before we took our break, and if you could continue right now, that would be just wonderful.
Yes. I met a person when I was writing this piece about the testimony of mind control subjects before a presidential commission in 1995, and he was somewhat reluctant to talk to me. He seemed quite sane and quite together, and said that he had been himself as a child used in some of these experiments, and that beyond what had happened to him, he knew something about their history. And what he told me was, he said, American children, as well as children from Mexico and South America, were used in this mind control program over a period of about 40 years, starting around 1948. And then, in fact, said the program might still be going on. And said that the idea was to create super agents who wouldn't remember what missions they carried out because of hypnotically induced amnesia, etc. And that the first wave of these children, mainly from Mexico and South America, were considered expendable. That is, they were tested or they were brainwashed with far cruder methods than eventually emerged. The idea was to use them as test subjects. And then from there, when the techniques were refined, to go on to what he said were the best and the brightest of American children, and to brainwash them, or some of them. And I said, best and the brightest, you mean children from very wealthy families and so on? He said, not necessarily, just the best and the brightest. That these, and I said, well, why? What would be the purpose of this? And he said he didn't think it was really a Cold War program, that is, that this was going to be used against the Soviets. And then I made a suggestion. I said, well, what about the idea that if the CIA/Pentagon units figured that these kids would one day rise to important positions in American society, and they wanted to gain long-term control over them, so they would be under their thumb, so they could tap them at will as a way of controlling future society? And he said, maybe that was what it was all about. So that you really would be talking about Manchurian candidates, in a sense, people that you could activate at certain times, people in key positions in the country. I thought that was very interesting.
I should say so. That's an understatement. I want to just briefly go back to Dr. Green for two reasons. First, a few nights ago, I was having dinner with a very famous writer who was talking about his brother. His brother is in the wind. I haven't seen him in years, and he claims to have been a victim of this type of program. And his family thought he was paranoid. He mentioned, and the man mentioned that very night to me, that the brother had claimed that he was under the control of a Dr. Green in Massachusetts. Now, also, I have found various suggestions here and there that Joseph Mengele, the notorious Joseph Mengele of Auschwitz, was also Dr. Green. And Joseph Mengele, after all, did not die until 1979, or supposedly died in 1979. And who knows where he might have been during this particular period. He could very well have been working in this country. For the U.S. government.
Right.
Because I know that they made extraordinary strides, in particular, in splitting children's personalities in the death camps. They learned how to do this. And, of course, this is the key, is it not? To split the personality so that they have a personality hidden inside the individual who they can control. Now, did Valerie Wolf get anywhere with people, with breaking the blocks that have been put up in these people?
She told me she did. She didn't go into details, but she said that she had developed a method of therapy that was working well, and that it seemed to be by trial and error, because obviously there was no system that you could rely on for this that had been established for doing the therapy, but that she was making good progress with this, and in particular with these two patients of hers, Chris and Claudia, that they were gradually recovering. So she felt that it was possible, and of course there was mention of the idea of multiple personalities and split personalities and that kind of thing that would be triggered by certain commands or words or so forth. You know, as you said this, Whitley, one thing that struck me is if you work with children, obviously, they are much more vulnerable. And so the idea of creating multiple personalities would seem in certain ways to be much easier because, for one thing, children have much stronger imaginations.
Yes.
And if they feel that something is wanted from them and the punishment for not giving it is too horrendous, they will create it.
That's right. And in fact, I think that's why this is done with children, because it's extremely difficult to induce multiple personalities in adults. But in children, it's easy, by comparison.
Yes.
That's my suspicion, in any case.
I would say so, too. I would think that's the case.
Now, what do you say to the riposte to this whole thing, which is that, these are all confabulated memories. These people are all disturbed, but they're not disturbed by actual events. They're disturbed by mental problems that they have, and they have invented all of this.
Yes. Well, these charges come from different places. For example, there is the FMSF, which is the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Yes.
And that's a group in the eastern part of the United States that has been formed to, quote, prove that there is no such thing as recovered memory in therapy. In other words, if the patient goes into therapy not remembering something, call it X, they will never recover it. That's just impossible.
Yes.
And that the only reason they would, quote, recover it is if the therapist induced them to and suggested that they should, in some way led them down the garden path. Well, the first thing we need to know about that organization is that it had several board members with CIA or military intelligence connections, including the notorious Dr. Louis Jolly West of UCLA, who's now deceased, who tried to establish, quote, a center for the study of violence at UCLA in the 1970s, and was finally, that center was never opened because of public protest, but the specialty of the center was going to be what was called at the time psychosurgery, which was a horrendous program of melting certain brain connections, supposedly to curb people's violent tendencies. So he was on the board, or a consultant to that organization, and so it stands to reason that the organization was formed in part in order to exonerate parents and other people who would have been connected to this brainwashing program and didn't want any of the information to come out.
That's right.
So that's number one. Number two, yes, in some cases, I believe that the charge of fabrication is true when you have an unscrupulous or grossly incompetent therapist who has an agenda and is trying to guide patients into such an area. Obviously, that can happen. And a patient on his own can make it all up. Certainly. I mean, these things happen all the time. But this is not a proof that in every case it's just utter fabrication. It's just, people have a tendency to write script, and if they're patients in therapy, they'll do it as well. But it's not a wholesale indictment of the information that has been emerging on these brainwashing programs.
We're going to take a little break here, and when we come back, we're going to continue just for a few moments on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which I have also researched extensively, and I'm going to share a little bit of that information with you, and we'll go on from there. We'll be right.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland Online.
We are back. We are talking to John Rappaport of insolutions.info, and I'm going to depart from my usual role of being the questioner for just a few moments, because there is some more information about the False Memory Syndrome Foundation that I would like to bring out in this interview. First, the amazing Randy, James Zwingle, who is anointed by the establishment with a MacArthur Genius Award, was also involved with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and I was one of the recipients of a group of audio tapes that were sent anonymously to quite a number of people in this country, where Mr. Zwingle is heard talking to teenage boys about the size of his own penis, which he later claimed he was part of a sting operation working with a police department, but would never identify that police department. In any case, this was all swept under the rug. Should it have been? I don't think so. Let's talk a little bit more about the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Interviewed in Amsterdam in June of 1991 and published as, quote, interview Holida Wakefield and Ralph Unterweger in the winter volume of Pedica, the Journal of Pedophilia. Ralph Unterweger, who was involved in the creation of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and originally served on its advisory board, was asked, is choosing pedophilia for you a responsible choice for the individual? Here's what he said in response in this magazine. Certainly it is responsible. What I have been struck by as I have come to know more about and understand people who choose pedophilia is they let themselves be too much defined by other people. Pedophiles spend a lot of time and energy defending their choice. I don't think that a pedophile needs to do that. Pedophiles can boldly and courageously affirm what they choose. That's not the end of the indictment of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which has been so touted in this country with its so-called work in proving that these memories are false. Jennifer Freud, a Harvard-educated professor, is the daughter of two members of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation board, and she has written a book called Betrayal Trauma, published by the Harvard University Press, a book which examines exactly why it is that children would bury memories like this, and why it is that these memories may be very real. She wrote the book and became involved because she was herself abused by her own parents. Now, John, let's go back to this discussion.
Oh, wow. Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. It doesn't end there. Subscribers, you're going to hear more. This terrible undertow in our country has got to be dealt with because it's too evil. It's evil beyond conception, and it is being covered up, and skillfully so, by an establishment that is made to look legitimate when actually it is anything but. Anything but. So, John, why don't you go on a little bit more with your researches in this area? Were you ever able to talk to any of the patients, for example, who Valerie Wolf was working with?
Yes. Let's see, it's been 13 years now, but I believe I talked to both Claudia and Chris on the telephone at the time, and they were believable to me in conversation. They certainly did not seem to be crazy. They didn't seem to be off on a rant or out of control. It seemed to me that they were trying to put together what had happened to them. They were somewhat afraid, understandably. They didn't seem, excessively calm, for sure.
No.
But they were struggling to make known what had happened to them. And one of the key moments in that period of research for me was a discussion that I had with Alan Shefflin, who's the author of a book called The Mind Manipulators, Paddington Press. It's out of print, but I'm sure there are copies somewhere. A very smart guy, a lawyer who has worked in this field for a long time. And he said that one of the things that convinced him that Valerie was on the right track as a therapist was that a certain piece of information, and he wouldn't go into detail on it with me, that was offered up by her patient, Claudia Mullen, about the mind control experiments, he knew to be true. It had to do with a certain connection between two different people involved in the program, and he said there was no way that she could know this was so from any published literature on the subject, that she would have had to come to this on her own. And so that convinced him that something was going on here that was not fabrication. But to follow up on your point, the larger view of this, what this means about our society, it's the medical aspect of it. In other words, the medical establishment, and I'm not trying to bring a wholesale indictment against the entire array of people who are involved in the medical system, but this brainwashing and mind control experimentation and torture and so on is always given a medical title, and medical people always emerge as being involved. And so there is this sort of patina of authority and legitimacy that's given to it, because people who don't know any better would say, well, doctors are doing this, and so these doctors must know what they're doing. And that is the result of an enormous amount of propaganda and publicity about the medical field itself, that we must bow down to doctors, right, that the medical authority, this is a new religion, and they are the high priests, and whatever they say, it must be so.
And you have a situation here where people use the authority or abuse the authority of the medical profession and abuse its dignity and abuse the Hippocratic Oath. They abuse everything. And you end up with a situation where a doctor, a legitimate one, like Valerie Wolf or Jennifer Freud, which is Freyd, by the way, folks, if you're interested in looking up her book, I'm sure it's available. It's called Betrayal Trauma, The Logic of Forgetting Child Abuse. These very legitimate people are, relatively speaking, marginalized. For example, despite Jennifer Freud's work and the extraordinary indictment that has just generally been true of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, it goes merrily on, pretending as if None of it ever happened.
Absolutely.
It's horrifying.
Two names that I would mention that people can look into. I don't think we have the time to go into it in depth, but Dr. Ewan Cameron, Cameron, first name Ewan, in Canada, was actually exposed for doing, I don't even know what to call it. It was mind control, but he was attempting to reprogram human beings completely from the ground up by erasing their memories, their personality, in horrendous drug treatment with people who hadn't volunteered, who thought they were just going to be patients.
This was part of the MKUltra program.
Yes, he was actually working for the CIA as a contractor on this. And all of this was exposed eventually, and the CIA had to pay out some pittance to families of the tortured. And another doctor, Paul Hoch, or Hoch, H-O-C-H, who eventually became the commissioner, another MD, of mental hygiene for the state of New York, had also earlier been part of the CIA program.
That's right.
And in one experiment, he gave a mental patient mescaline, and the patient went on some, extraordinarily up and down trip. And then Hoch followed this by doing an actual leucotomy on the patient right there.
Which is a leucotomy?
Like that is cutting out part of the brain. Gave the patient LSD, a local anesthetic, proceeded to remove pieces of the cerebral cortex, asking at various moments to the patient whether the patient's perceptions were changing. So if you can imagine a human being doing something like this, as a doctor who would later become commissioner of mental hygiene for the state of New York, you begin to have an idea of the kinds of people who participated in the mind control.
You know what's so frightening about that is the one of the types of experiments that was carried out at Auschwitz.
Uh-huh.
So it sounds to me as if this man may have been trained by someone who worked at Auschwitz.
Could very well be. This happened in the mid-1950s that he did this particular experiment, so it was only 10 years after the end of the war.
And the achievements that of those monsters in Germany, mind control achievements, were definitely co-opted. They were brought into the United States and into Russia, different ones, and both countries raced to gain this knowledge and make use of it for themselves. But unfortunately, in my view, evil is a living, conscious presence, and you open the door to it, you get into big trouble. A country that opens the door to it has no choice but to cleanse itself. Otherwise, just go down and down and down. And I don't know how you react to that, but that's how
well,
I feel.
Absolutely. And I would add to that, this is what you get when you reach the end of the road on the philosophy of materialism.
It's very true.
When you believe that there is nothing in this universe that is anything but circulating subatomic particles and waves, and that the notion of freedom and free will and free choice and imagination and creativity and love and all of that are total illusions that are fostered by little chemical reactions in the brain, and it doesn't really matter, nothing matters. What you end up with is a view of the human being and all of the universe as nothing but a gigantic kind of machine.
A machine.
And therefore, whatever you do to human beings is completely justified. And you can read in some of the writings of these torturers and lunatic psychiatrists that they, in fact, such as Ewan Cameron, do believe that the human being has no right to his own personality.
Exactly.
That is just simply some sort of ridiculous, thought, and therefore everyone should be programmed completely so that we have a society in which everything is utterly under control and it is in very heavy quotes, the greatest good for the greatest number by their definition of what that means?
By their definition of what that means, yes. Unfortunately, we are richly alive spiritual beings, and we all have choices to make in this world. If you make a certain choice, you go in a certain direction. These people have made their choice, and now they would like to take us all in the same direction in order to justify the wisdom of their mistake. However, I'm not going that way. I have another direction I want to go in.
Me too.
And John, on that note, I think it's time for us to come to the end of Dreamland, but I have to tell you, this has been a most extraordinary and illuminating conversation. I want to thank you very much for being with us. John Rappaport's website, insolutions.info. That's insolutions.info. Don't miss it.
It's been illuminating for me too, Whitley. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us. Next week on Dreamland, we continue our exploration of intelligence community, children, and mind control with the Franklin scandal. Don't miss it.
You've been listening to Dreamland. Be sure to tune in again next week. Dreamland is brought to you by UnknownCountry.com and our family of subscribers. Our news editor is Ann Strieber. Our science reporter is Linda Moulton Howe. Our webmaster is Daniel Stiegel. And I'm your Dreamland announcer, Brian Arnold. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.